At 5:19 on a fog-drenched morning near the outskirts of Aachen in October 1944, Private First Class Daniel Harlow of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division stood ankle-deep in churned mud, gripping a strange, improvised metal device that looked nothing like standard Army issue. It was a crude hybrid, part wrench, part crowbar, part something else entirely. Its steel-tempered black from battlefield use. To anyone watching, it seemed absurd. To Harlow, it was survival. The 1st Infantry had been pushing through a maze of farm roads and shell-shattered orchards when German armor, 2 Panzer IVs and a Stu G3, counterattacked from the mist. The American lines fractured. Squads scattered. Radio calls dissolved into static. And Harlow found himself trapped behind a collapsed stone wall, cut off from his platoon, eyes fixed on a 25-ton machine grinding through the haze. Then the lead Panzer erupted violently, its turret blasting upward in a cone of orange fire. The explosion shook the ground beneath Harlow's boots, showering the orchard with burning scraps of armor plate. For a brief moment, the light from the blast illuminated him, a lone infantryman framed by flame, holding that bizarre metal tool as though it were a lifeline. But the destruction of the tank wasn't luck, and it wasn't random. It was the result of something Harlow had done, something that had required nerve, timing, and a willingness to crawl into a place no sane soldier wanted to be when enemy armor rolled through. What Harlow didn't know yet, standing in the glow of the burning Panzer, was that the tool in his hand would be the key to surviving the next 20 minutes, minutes in which he would outwit armored crews, evade German infantry, and attempt something that American doctrine warned soldiers never to try. The fireball from the destroyed Panzer hadn't even settled when Harlow dropped to one knee, pressing himself against the collapsed stone wall for cover. The heat washed over him, rippling through the morning fog and filling the air with the bitter stench of burning fuel and scorched rubber. Somewhere behind the smoke, German voices shouted sharp, alarmed, echoing across the orchard rows. Harlow tightened his grip on the strange metal tool. To any other soldier, it was junk, a modified track tension wrench scavenged from a wrecked half-track, reshaped by a frontline mechanic to pry open jam turret hatches and lift stubborn engine covers. Heavy, awkward, ugly. But in the cramped chaos of close-quarters tank hunting, it was priceless. Because there had been a problem. Just 20 minutes earlier, when the German counterattack punched through the orchard, Harlow's squad had been tasked with stopping the armored thrust long enough for reinforcements to redeploy. The platoon's only bazooka team had been knocked out by the first Stu G's opening volley, leaving Harlow and a handful of riflemen scrambling to improvise. As the tanks advanced, Harlow spotted a narrow drainage ditch running alongside the orchard road. The ditch was shallow, barely waist-deep, but it threaded all the way to a cluster of supply sheds where a disabled American half-track sat abandoned. If he could reach that wreck, he might find tools, spare charges, anything that could help. He sprinted for the ditch under machine gun fire. Mud splashed. Bullets cracked overhead. One round tore through his sleeve. Another ricocheted off a stone in front of him, showering him with dust. But he made it, sliding into the ditch, breath ragged, heart pounding. That's where he found the mechanic's improvised metal bar. It was heavy, yes, but perfectly shaped for leverage. And leverage was exactly what he needed when he crawled beneath the Panzer that would explode minutes later. The armor's belly plates were coated with mud and clay from the rainstorm the night before, and the German crew hadn't secured the auxiliary fuel access panel properly in the rush to advance. Harlow had used a makeshift tool to pry the panel open just enough to wedge in a white phosphorus grenade. He barely escaped before the blast. Now crouched behind the collapsed wall, he heard the grinding tracks of the second enemy vehicle, the Stu G3, maneuvering to find whoever had taken out the Panzer. Stu G crews were notoriously cautious in close terrain. Their low silhouette made them excellent ambush hunters, and they preferred to fire from hull-down positions where only the cannon protruded from cover. But the German infantry supporting the armored thrust were even more dangerous here. Harlow peeked over the wall. Through thinning smoke, he spotted them. 7 grenadiers advancing in staggered formation along the orchard row, rifles raised, helmets low, moving with the practiced discipline of men who had survived months of brutal fighting. They weren't confused, they were hunting. Harlow sank back behind cover. The situation had worsened. He was alone, pinned between infantry and armor, with no radio and only one grenade left, plus the strange tool in his hand. He scanned the ground, desperate for anything else he could use. A broken crate, spent casings, a torn piece of canvas. Nothing. Then he noticed the orchard's irrigation trench, a narrow depression running past the burning panzer carcass toward a small cluster of abandoned German supply carts. It offered concealment, barely, but if he crawled fast and low, he might reach the carts before the grenadiers saw him. He took a breath, and he moved. Smoke rolled across the ground, carrying embers with it. The soil under his elbows was hot from the burning armor. He crawled inch by inch, pressing the metal tool against his chest to keep it from clanking. Behind him, the Stoogee's engine revved deeply. Harlow froze. He recognized that sound. The Stoogee wasn't searching anymore. It was lining up for a high-explosive shot. And the collapsed stone wall he had just abandoned was directly in the cannon's path. He ducked into the trench just as the Stoogee fired. The blast obliterated the wall, sending shards of stone and dirt raining across the orchard. The shockwave rolled over Harlow like a physical shove, leaving his ears ringing. But he kept moving. He reached the German supply carts, 3 wooden frames on iron wheels, half filled with engineering tools, spare track links, infantry gear, and demolition charges. And that was when he realized something. He wasn't just trying to survive anymore. He had an opportunity. The Stoogee was now advancing slowly, cautiously, blind to infantry threats directly beside or behind it. If Harlow could reach the vehicle unseen, he might be able to disable it the same way he had the Panzer, by exploiting what tank crews feared most, a determined infantryman in close quarters. But first he needed a plan and a tool. His eyes drifted to the bizarre metal bar in his hand. Harlow sifted through the supply carts with frantic precision, every movement sharp, deliberate, silent. The Stoogee's engine throbbed steadily somewhere behind the orchard smoke. Slow, cautious, predatory. German grenadiers were still advancing from the right flank, methodically clearing each row. Time was collapsing around him. He found what he needed: a bundle of telemine fuses, small, sensitive, and dangerously unstable when mishandled. Next to them lay 2 Gabalt Ladon clusters, the German bundle charges, made by wiring multiple stick grenade heads around a central explosive. Crude, but devastating against armor. But there was a problem. The charges were incomplete. No activation handles, no pull cords. Whoever had stored them had done so hastily, likely expecting to arm them later. And without the proper igniters, they were nothing more than inert lumps of metal. Harlow's pulse hammered. He needed a way to trigger at least one. He glanced again at the tool, the strange, improvised metal bar with its hooked end and angular wedge. And there, in the cart beneath it, he saw an idea forming. A battered German engineer's satchel lay half open, containing a spool of wire striker plate, and a single unused WWII pull igniter normally attached to stick grenades. The igniter used a small ceramic bead to snap a friction wire. Simple, reliable, deadly. He grabbed it all and worked quickly, cutting wire with a jagged piece of metal, wrapping the brittle fuses together, and building a crude, improvised detonation trigger. It was ugly, fragile, and absolutely lethal. The plan was forming. Use the irrigation trench to circle behind the Stoogee. Climb onto its rear deck unseen. Use the metal tool to pry open the engine access hatch. Plant the improvised charge and drop off before detonation. It was insane, an act straight out of a field manual's do not attempt sidebar. But as Harlow peeked through the orchard branches, he saw the Stoogee's crew making a critical error. Believing American infantry had retreated, they were pushing forward without dismounted support. The grenadiers were now 40 yards away, too far to cover the armored vehicle's blind spots. Harlow slid into the trench again, following it until it veered left, leading toward the Stoogee's flank. The ditch narrowed into a shallow rut carved by retreating rainwater. Mud clung to his uniform. His fingers shook around the explosive charge he'd built. The metal bar thumped gently against his chest. He reached a point where the trench ended at a broken stump. Beyond it, only 5 yards of open ground separated him from the Stoogee's rear quarter. The assault gun crept forward, its low profile cutting through the mist like a shark's fin through water. The commander was exposed from the waist up, scanning forward with binoculars, unaware that death crawled behind him. Harlow took a breath, then another. Then he moved. He kept low, nearly flat, boots dragging silently across the damp soil. The Stoogee's exhaust pipe chugged out oily smoke that stung his eyes. The armored skirts rattled as the tracks negotiated broken ground. Each sound masked his footsteps perfectly. He reached the rear. The engine deck radiated heat, intense, almost scalding. Harlow rose just high enough to plant his boot on the back plate, then climbed silently onto the vehicle. The metal burned through his soles, but he didn't hesitate. He crouched on the rear deck. The commander was still facing forward. The grenadiers were still too far to see him. The fog still clung to the orchard like a veil. He positioned the metal tool under the engine hatch seam and pushed. At first, the hatch refused to budge. Stoogee crews often secured them with improvised wire or clamps to prevent sabotage. He pushed harder. The metal groaned. The hatch shifted, barely. Then the vehicle hit a bump. In that moment of vibration, Harlow drove the wedge home. The hatch popped open by 3 inches. Just enough. He pulled the improvised charge from his jacket, slid it into the gap, and hooked the wire around the hatch hinge, so pulling it shut would arm the fuse. But there was something he didn't know yet. The Stoogee commander was turning around. Harlow saw the motion, just a shift in shadow, and froze. The commander spun fully, eyes widening as he spotted Harlow crouched on the engine deck, metal tool in hand, caught in the act. The German reached for his sidearm. Harlow slammed. The hatch closed. The igniter snapped. The charge armed. And in that split second before detonation, Harlow had only one choice: jump. Harlow didn't think, he reacted. The instant the igniter snapped, he kicked off the Stoogee's engine deck and hurled himself sideways into the orchard. The world blurred into smoke, branches, and raw instinct. He hit the ground hard, rolled twice, and pressed his face into the mud just as the charge detonated. The explosion wasn't loud, it was violent. A deep metallic whump punched the air as the improvised bundle charge erupted inside the engine compartment. The Stoogee lurched forward, track seizing, a plume of fire blasting out through the ventilation grills. Shrapnel, twisted fragments of engine casing, and shattered bolts rained across the orchard. The commander didn't scream. He simply disappeared into a gout of flame and smoke. Harlow raised his head. The Stoogee bucked, groaned, and then sagged sideways as its engine died in a choking roar. Flames licked out from the hatch he'd pried open with the tool, still clutched in his hand. The vehicle was finished, but the danger wasn't. The grenadiers who had been advancing earlier now sprinted toward the burning assault gun, shouting frantically. They had seen Harlow jump. They understood exactly what had happened. And now, fueled by fury and shock, they crossed the orchard with ruthless purpose. Harlow scrambled behind a row of trees, lungs burning, uniform smeared with mud and smoke. His right shoulder throbbed from a fall. He had no rifle. He dropped it during the crawl. Only a pistol with 3 rounds left, a single grenade, and the battered metal tool that had saved him twice already. He moved deeper between the trees, trying to angle southwest toward friendly lines, but the terrain worked against him. The orchard rows were straight, ordered, designed for farming, not evasion. Every path eventually opened into clear sight lines where a German marksman could pick him off, and the grenadiers were spreading into a skirmish line. 7 men, veterans by the way they moved, rifles at low, ready, fan out perfect. They were trying to corner him. Harlow ducked behind a split apple tree, its trunk blasted by earlier shell fire. He checked his pistol, breathed once, then twice. His fingers traced the edges of the metal tool. Still warm, still vital. It wasn't a weapon, but it was leverage, reach, force. Think, Dan. Think. The burning Stoogee crackled behind him. Smoke drifted low, clinging to the orchard floor. If he could use it as concealment, he might slip past the German line and disappear into the irrigation ditch again. But the grenadiers were too fast. Gunfire erupted, sharp, disciplined bursts. Rounds chewed into the tree trunk, sending splinters snapping past his face. He ducked, rolled, sprinted to another tree. More shots. A round brushed his thigh. Hot, numbing, grazing flesh. He needed a way to break their formation. His eyes landed on the ground. A cluster of fallen apples, soft and punctured, scattered across the soil. An idea flashed, crazy, desperate, but workable. He pulled the last grenade from his belt and wedged it inside one of the hollowed apples, leaving only the pin visible. He lobbed it high, very high, so it arced over the grenadiers and landed far behind them with a soft thud. The Germans saw the movement, but not the object. They turned, thinking he'd tried a wild, long-range throw in panic. They didn't realize the grenade was hidden until the fuse burned down. The explosion tore through the orchard floor just behind their formation, blowing debris upward and showering them with mud and splinters. The shock wasn't meant to kill, just disrupt. It worked. Their formation broke. Exactly the opening Harlow needed. He sprinted, hard, faster than he'd moved all morning. Their formation broke. Exactly the opening Harlow needed. He sprinted, hard, faster than he'd moved all morning. Gunfire chased him, tearing leaves and branches. He zigzagged between trees, dove across the narrow road, and tumbled into the irrigation ditch, once more his breath ragged, throat burning from smoke inhalation. He crawled fast, using the ditch's curve to conceal his movement. When he finally reached a deeper bend, he stopped and listened. Footsteps, German voices, shouts of anger and confusion. They had lost sight of him, but the danger wasn't over. The grenade trick had bought him only moments, not safety. And ahead lay another problem. The orchard ended at an open field, over 150 yards of exposed terrain with no cover except scattered shell craters. Beyond that field were American lines, or what remained of them. Harlow gripped the metal tool tightly. It had helped him defeat 2 armored vehicles. But crossing open ground under rifle fire was a different kind of war. He waited for his pulse to calm. Then he prepared to run. Harlow waited in the ditch, listening for any sign. The grenadiers were closing in. The orchard crackled with the sound of distant fires, the burnt sugar smell of apples mixing with diesel and cordite. Smoke drifted in slow, ghost-like sheets across the rows. The Germans were still out there, frustrated, methodical, sweeping carefully. But they hadn't yet discovered the ditch's far bend. This was his only window. He pulled himself to the lip of the trench and peeked over. The open field lay still under a layer of pale fog, the kind that hugged the soil and distorted distance. A few shell craters pocked the terrain, shallow, scattered, unpredictable. Beyond them, across roughly 150 yards of bare space, Harlow could just make out the faint silhouettes of American helmets behind a low earthen berm. Friendly lines, if he could reach them. But there was a problem. Between him and those foxholes, the Germans had begun repositioning. 2 grenadiers moved toward the field's edge, their rifles at the ready, scanning. If he ran too early, they'd cut him down. Too late, and they'd spot him at the ditch itself. He needed timing, noise, a distraction. He checked his pockets. No grenades, no smokes. Only his pistol and the battered metal tool. He turned the heavy bar over in his hands. It wasn't a weapon, but it had weight, enough to make noise if thrown, enough to make the Germans look the wrong way for just a second. He crouched low, drew a breath, and hurled the tool across the ditch mouth with all the strength he had left. It clattered loudly against a pile of broken branches 20 yards away. The Germans snapped toward the sound. That was the moment Harlow exploded from the ditch, sprinting into the open field, with every muscle screaming. His boots hammered the wet soil. Breath tore from his chest. He ran in long, desperate strides, weaving toward the nearest shell crater. A rifle cracked behind him, then another. A round hissed past his ear. Another tore through the fog in front of him, close enough for him to feel the heat. He dove into the first crater, mud splashing up around him. He didn't stop. He rolled out the far side, sprinted again, lungs burning, vision narrowing into a tunnel of effort and instinct. Shouts rose behind him, anger, frustration, disbelief that one man was still alive after ambushing armor and outrunning infantry. Halfway across the field, the American lines erupted. Rifles barked. A Browning machine gun thundered from berm. Tracer fires streaked across the fog. The Germans ducked, suppressed by the sudden volume of fire. Harlow used the chaos to push harder, sprinting toward the next crater. A bullet punched into the soil at his feet, spraying dirt up his legs. Another cracked into the rim just as he dropped low, sliding into the depression with a gasp. 60 yards left. He forced himself up again. His legs felt disconnected, mechanical, no longer obeying anything but momentum. He pushed harder, each stride tearing at his muscles. American voices shouted, "Run. Keep coming. We've got you covered. Move, buddy." Harlow stumbled, caught himself, kept going. 30 yards. 20. 10. Then 2 American riflemen vaulted the berm and rushed forward, grabbing him under the arms as his knees buckled. They dragged him the last few feet into the foxhole as bullets snapped overhead. He collapsed against the bunker wall, chest heaving, uniform soaked with mud, sweat, and smoke. The world spun around him, a whirl of noise and relief. "You all right, buddy?" one of the riflemen asked. Harlow nodded, barely able to speak. He held out a trembling hand. "I dropped my tool." The rifleman blinked, confused. "You're what?" Harlow managed a faint, exhausted laugh. "That metal thing saved my life twice." Behind them, the field slowly quieted as German fire tapered off. The Stu-G burned steadily in the orchard. The earlier Panzers still raged in a column of oily smoke. By noon, reinforcements pushed forward, securing the orchard and driving the remaining grenadiers back toward Aachen. When engineers examined the destroyed Stu-G, they found the detonated charge still wired on the hatch hinge. Primitive, improvised, effective. When the fighting finally subsided that afternoon, the orchard was a wasteland of scorched trees, cratered soil, and smoking armor. Medics treated Harlow for cuts, bruises, and a deep graze along his thigh, injuries he barely remembered receiving. His uniform was torn, soaked, and streaked with engine oil. His hands were blistered from gripping the overheated metal tool. But he was alive. Word spread quickly through the 1st Infantry Division. One private had disabled 2 armored vehicles, a Panzer IV and a Stu-G3, using improvised charges, a single grenade, and a bizarre, jury-rigged metal bar taken from an abandoned half-track. Infantrymen whispered about him in foxholes. Engineers shook their heads in disbelief. Officers struggled to write a report that didn't sound exaggerated. In truth, what Harlow accomplished violated almost every rule in the U.S. Army's anti-armor doctrine. Infantry were instructed to avoid getting close to enemy tanks unless supported by bazookas or dedicated tank hunters. Climbing onto an active assault gun in fog-covered terrain, alone and without backup, bordered on madness. But war often rewards the men willing to do what doctrine never anticipates. Harlow stayed with the 1st Infantry through the remainder of the Aachen campaign and into the Hurtgen forest. He fought quietly, competently, never calling attention to the moment that would define him. After the war, he returned to a small machine shop in Ohio, where he spent the rest of his life working with tools far less dangerous than the one that had saved him in 1944. The strange metal bar, the one engineers never recovered, became a piece of frontline folklore. Some claimed it was vaporized in the Stu-G blast. Others said a German grenadier carried it off. But among the soldiers who heard the story, it became a symbol of grit, improvisation, and the terrifying closeness of infantry versus armor combat. To this day, the official after-action report lists the incident simply: enemy armor destroyed by individual action under extreme conditions. If this story moved you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps keep these long-form war narratives alive. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if anyone in your family ever served in World War II or worked with armor. And if you want more cinematic, deeply researched war stories every week, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.